Hi, this is Pastor Bruce of the Arkport Presbyterian Church in Arkport, New York. And I'm glad you're going to join us this day for another biblical archaeology video. I recently have been on study leave and have been pursuing one of my favorite hobbies, which is biblical archaeology. It does a lot to bolster my faith. It deepens my understanding of Scripture and it encourages me. It seems to delight my heart. I hope the same is true for you. We will be doing a 4-part series on a copper field in southern Israel. It's a pretty exciting story with a lot of turns in a very beautiful place of the world. And so I hope you enjoy this video series as much as I have really enjoyed putting it together. Thank you for joining us. Well, we are starting our Timna copper field with its many twists and turns, a story of the Timna copper field, by telling what I'm calling the Egyptian story. We will have other parts that bring us closer to the characters that we find in the Bible, but we want to start with this background, as we call it, the Egyptian story. In our lecture series, there are a number of things that we hope to learn. Of course, the history of Timna as a copper minefield in the Negev desert. It actually starts about 5000 BC is the beginning date of when Negev was first being mined for copper, or Timna was being mined for copper. But we're going to pick up the story around 1300 BC to about 1177 BC. That's a very specific year, and you'll learn in this lesson why we can, with some degree of confidence, pick that as the final year in which copper was mined by the Egyptians at Timna. We also are going to be exposed to how the secular historical narrative is greatly influenced by what is being discovered in the ground, what the archaeological evidence says. And of course, we wouldn't want the secular historical narrative to not pay attention to what's being found. In the case of the Timna copper field, it's very interesting because the story has been nuanced and even reversed on multiple occasions. And that makes for a very interesting storytelling. At the end, I believe your conviction that the Bible is a reliable source of historical information will be affirmed. But the secular historical narrative has meandered and wandered back and forth over exactly that question. In our lecture series, we'll learn about some archaeological tools and techniques, at least one technique that I think is unfamiliar to you at this moment, and that'll be fun. It's always good to learn about how do we gain our understanding. And we'll see rich connections between archaeology and the biblical narrative. And these rich connections include the Egyptian influences, the Midianites, and the Edomites. Today, we will introduce Egyptian and Midianite influences, and later on, we'll see more Egyptian influences in relationship to the Timna copper field. And along the way, we will certainly be bringing in Bible knowledge because, well, biblical archaeology is about that. It's about bolstering our faith, understanding what the Bible says, and by the benefit of seeing things, it helps us understand it just a little bit better. In some cases, just sealing for us the biblical narrative. Well, if I asked you, where is Timna? My guess is many of you would either shrug your shoulders or guess that it is in the middle of nowhere. And if that was your guess, it's a pretty good guess. Middle of nowhere. It's 300 miles from Egypt, or from the Nile River, about 140 miles south of Jerusalem. It's 15 miles north of the Red Sea. It really is in the middle of nowhere. The annual rainfall in Timna and surrounding area is under 1 inch per year. So it is very arid. And by upstate New York standard, it's also pretty hot in the summertime. 100 degrees Fahrenheit, more than 110 in the peak of the day is very, very common. It's not as hot as our friends in Arizona or United Arab Emirates experience summer, but for our sensibilities, it's pretty warm. Now, Timna is located along what's called the Dead Sea Fault. We have two tectonic plates, the African plate on the west and the Arabian plate on the east. And the edge of these two plates fall right along, or I might say it the other way, the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River and the Dead Sea fall right along this rift between these two plates. What is a rift? Well, if two tectonic plates have pressure to come together, they move towards one another, and a tectonic mountain is built up as the edges of the plates crumple upwards. But if two plates are drifting slowly apart, what happens is a valley is formed. But I think you know also that when two tectonic plates come together, wherever there's a seam of tectonic plates, there's likely also to be earthquake activity. And indeed, Jerusalem is an earthquake-prone region of the world, and earthquakes will have an impact on our story of the copper minefield in Timna. Well, I'll see a big nugget on the left. Well, it's a big boulder with a lot of copper on it. This area of Timna was discovered by the Western world in the 1800s, but it wasn't really archaeologically explored, not in the scientific archaeology sense of that word, until the 1930s by Nelson Glueck, a rather famous archaeologist in his time period. And Nelson Glueck, when he found the copper, initially linked it to the biblical kingdom of Solomon. And his reasons for doing that perhaps were more grounded in faith than archaeological evidence. You have to ask the question, how did Solomon get so rich if the Bible stories are, accurate portrayals of how things were in his time? And one of the explanations which would immediately present itself is if he had mines, and here mines of copper, which what Glueck discovered. Now, at the time that Glueck made this discovery and in his archaeological dig, it was very popular to think about Solomon and his mines. Now, that's not a biblical expression, but it was a very popular book, a popular play, and it was a very popular concept that Solomon must have had mines, which gave rise to his enormous wealth. I have a little excerpt in the upper right-hand corner, just says, copper was an incredibly important resource. Obviously, it was an essential resource in the Copper Age. It's an essential resource in the Bronze Age because bronze is made of copper and tin. But even in the Iron Age, it was a very valuable resource. And this particular commentator said it is to be thought of like coal is in our age, a very useful commodity of great value. So that's how things were in the 1930s, and that impression that these were Solomon's mines would last for about 30 years. But then in the 1960s, a new dig was conducted, and it uncovered the Temple of Hathor. And there were other indications as well that this was an Egyptian site dating back to the very late Bronze Age, centuries before David and Solomon. And so this scientific archaeological dig kind of put Nelson Glueck's idea on its head. And there were a great number of articles that you could find going back to the 60s where there seemed to be some delight in poo-pooing the biblical narrative of Solomon being rich, of this being this region of the Negev desert being part of the Davidic and Solomonic empire of Israel. And that poo-pooing of this being Solomon's mines really lasted for about 50 years. And so you could still find articles being written in the early 21st century, the 2000s, where there was still delight being taken in saying, yeah, no evidence that Solomon had any wealth, no evidence whatsoever that this copper field related to Solomon or David. Well, more recently, starting, I believe, in the year 2012 and ongoing to this very day, there is significant archaeological work that points to the idea that the peak of Timna copper mining did not take place with the Egyptians, but actually the peak mining activity took place in the 10th century BCE, which would place it squarely in the Davidic and Solomonic period. So, does this mean it's Solomon's mines? We're going to discuss that in more detail in future video lessons. I will tell you that's not the only hypothesis that's out there. The other hypothesis is that these are Edomite mines, possibly operated by Edomites, but I don't want to give away our future lectures, so I'll just say stay tuned. Now, before we look at the archaeological findings that are there from the Egyptian period, I just wanted us to share in the delight of what a beautiful place Timna is. And so I just have a few photos of just the beauty of this desert. Now, when you take this particular picture that we're looking at, it's hard to tell, even if this is Earth, but it is just absolutely beautiful. You can certainly appreciate that it is arid, not a lot of vegetation to be seen here in the Rift Valley. On the other side is one of the mountain ranges that defines the edges of that Rift Valley as the two continents are drifting apart. Here's a picture looking down into the valley from one side to the other. You see a lot of erosion and a lot of rock outcroppings. Beautiful, but scary. You wouldn't want to have to walk across that in the heat of summer. I'm not sure you could carry enough water by yourself to get to the other side. Colorful rock outcroppings, just more of the same. But again, it's useful to take a little time to appreciate the beauty. Now, this looks like it could be taken in the Grand Canyon or in Sedona, Arizona area with beautiful red sands and the very dry, eroded cliffs. A lot of sandstone in Timna Valley or the Rift Valley in this area. And so where you have sandstone, it's very common to find arches, erosion arches. And here's one of the many beautiful arches that is available to be found in Timna. I just find this to be very beautiful, and I look forward to visiting Timna Park on my next visit to Israel. Here is a picture of an outcropping in the bottom of the valley, and I'm glad that there are people walking upon it so you can get some perspective of how big this is. What we have here is something that's called a mushroom. And it's an erosion formation that is common in the Timna Valley. And it is probably caused by wind erosion rather than water erosion. In the upper right-hand corner, you see some holes that were dug into the limestone so that the copper could be accessed by the copper miners. And just some other pretty pictures of the area. It's just a beautiful place. Many arches, as I said. This is just one of many that lends itself to photography. Distant photography through the arches, just very, very pretty. And now we encounter the tunnels in which copper mining takes place or did take place. I imagine The chiseling that took place here left rougher edges, but over the 3,000 years since this was last mined, or 2,000 years since it was last mined, it's easy to imagine that windstorms and sand erosion have really smoothed out the limestone over time. We do see vertical air shafts that were carved into these copper mines, and Timna is believed to be the earliest example of minefields where people drilled ventilation holes. Very pretty photography is to be had here. Thousands and thousands of years old are some of these tunnels. And you can walk through some of these tunnels at the historical park in Timna if you were to visit it. It's always good to have a human in the picture so you can get some perspective. These are not huge tunnels. This is hard work, hard labor, done by hand, not machinery apart from simple tools, hand tools. I'm guessing this is the wet season. The clouds look a little different, and we see some salt bush on the valley floor. I look at this land and I'm thinking, boy, if the government gave me 40 acres and a mule, I would try to get out of there alive with my mule. This is just not good land for agriculture. Two more pictures to finish up with the beauty of the land. Another mushroom, just beautiful skies to be photographed here. And an evening sunset with a mountain goat. You might think it's an ibex, but it is indeed a mountain goat. How they get up there, I don't know. They're pretty amazing creatures. And so we're going to leave the beauty of Timna behind us as we now start to explore the Egyptian influence. It's part of the story of the Timna copper mine field. But from what we've already looked at, what do we know? Well, Timna is geographically isolated, and transportation is going to be an issue. That's just going to be an issue. And protection from marauders is going to be an issue. A minefield like this cannot be operated as a mom and pop operation because if marauders come, who will defend? Who is the threat to make consequences to marauders taking over the copper minefield and just ripping out copper and selling it, if you will, on the market? You need nation states to protect against marauders. And as I said, transportation is an issue. The miners are incapable of producing their own food. This land will not produce food. If you're smelting copper, I mean, there are only two ways to get copper out of there. You either bring many, many, many tons of ore, or you just bring, fewer tons of smelted copper. Well, if you're going to smelt copper on station, you need to bring in fuel for smelting. Wood does not exist in this area. You'll need to send it. Oh, big operation. You should think this takes a sophisticated economy, a big operation. We're bringing in food. We're bringing in fuel. And, oh, by the way, your people, your animals need water. And the nearest water for people and animals is about 50 miles away from Timna. So as I mentioned, copper has been mined here since about the 5th century BC, but we're focusing on the Egyptian story from about 1300 BC to 1177 BC, and then a little tail that takes us to around 1150 BC. Now, the Egyptians were pagans, and they believed that to extract copper from the earth, they needed permission. Permission from the goddess Hathor. She is, after all, the goddess of mining. And so to receive, if you will, this divine license from Hathor, they built a temple at which they would make offerings to that goddess. So in the 1960s, the excavation of Timna turned up this temple to Hathor. And this was one of the early signs, oh, this is indeed an Egyptian minefield dating back to about 1300. The year 1300. And we know that this original temple was built by Pharaoh Seti I, but then there was an earthquake, remember? Timna is on that rift valley between two tectonic plates, the Arabian tectonic plate and the African tectonic plate, and earthquakes are common. And an earthquake destroyed the temple, needed to be rebuilt by Pharaoh Ramses II. And the first courtyard was about 50 feet by 50 feet, not very large, but we really don't know how many Egyptians were working the copper minefield back in this time period. We found this carving of a woman's head and believe it to be the goddess Hathor, Timna. It's a beautiful finding, not sure who it's of, but the working hypothesis is that it is an image of Hathor. At the archaeological site of the temple, over 10,000 artifacts were cataloged by the excavations done in the 60s. Many of those related to sacrifices brought to the goddess. And in the upper right-hand corner is an artistic rendering of what the temple would have looked like in its heyday. Now, the lower right and left-hand images are what you can see today of the partially reconstructed temple to Hathor, if you were to go to visit the park today. On the cliff behind the temple is a carving, hard to make out with the naked eye, but it is a carving of Ramses III. And he's making some sort of offering to the goddess Hathor. And the goddess on the right hand is holding an ankh, a symbol of fertility and life. So plenty of evidence that this was an Egyptian copper minefield existing in the 1300s to about 1177. Now, this is either an archaeologist or a student on a dig, but she is excavating a burial site in which a pregnant woman was found, which is very unusual. The Egyptians did not leave their dead behind, but rather brought them back to Egypt. And this is the only evidence of a woman in the Egyptian period being present at this copper minefield. Now, we think that the body might have been left behind because it would come towards the very end of Egyptian operations, and perhaps they closed out of the minefield very, very quickly and buried their dead instead of transporting them back to Egypt. That's all hypothesis. A beautiful bead was found with the female skeleton that was buried at Timna. And the working hypothesis is, why is there a woman, pregnant woman buried at Timna? The working hypothesis is that she was related to temple worship. Perhaps she was a musician, perhaps she was a singer, being that she was pregnant, perhaps she wasn't a dancer, who knows? But the thought is that maybe the reason a woman was there was not because she was the wife of a worker or an overseer of workers or a worker herself, but that maybe she was related to temple worship. That's all speculation. Well, all good things come to an end, and Egypt's running of the mine comes to an end right around 1177. And that's a very specific date, but we're pretty confident about that date. Something important happens around 1177. It is the collapse of the Bronze Age. There are 6 major empires in the Mediterranean ancient Near East at this time. All 6 empires either collapse or go into tremendous retrograde. The Mycenaean Empire, it collapses. The Hittite Empire, it collapses. The Assyrian Empire it collapses. Now, in the Bible, we will encounter Assyrians again, but they have virtually no relationship to this Assyrian empire from where they live, because this empire goes through a complete collapse. Similarly, the Babylonian Empire, not shown on the map, but it's to the right or to the east of the Assyrians. They collapse. When the Babylonians arise in the biblical period, they are, I say the biblical period, I mean the time of the conquests. They are a new empire with very distant roots to the Babylonian Empire. The Midianites Empire, which is to the north of the Hittites in Turkey, they completely collapse. In Egypt is nearly destroyed and following this collapse, but instead they survive. They are merely greatly weakened by this collapse of the Bronze Age. What gives rise to this collapse? Well, archaeologists really don't know, but one of the working hypotheses is that tin was disrupted coming out of Afghanistan. There was a war between the Babylonians and a nation state to their east that did disrupt the flow of tin. Bronze is made of 85% copper, 14 or 15% tin. Sometimes some exotic metals are also put in to bronze. The economies of these six empires were all highly interdependent. There was a global economy. There was a lot of trade. When one empire collapses, other empires are going to feel the consequences. And indeed, 5 out of the 6 do collapse. There is a concurrent, or at the same time, aggravating factor known as the Sea Peoples. Who are the Sea Peoples? Well, we can think of them as pirates coming out of the Aegean Sea. They have Mediterranean and actually, sort of Greek DNA and blood, and they have made an innovation to sailing vessels, which make them suitable for projecting power across the Mediterranean Sea. They are thought to have been a otherwise poorish people who were taken advantage of by the 6 dominant empires. And so there is this war that takes place by these sea peoples who participate in devastating the Mycenaean Empire. Archaeological evidence attests to them. Written and archaeological evidence attests to them attacking Egypt, and Egypt is nearly sacked by the Sea Peoples, but they do manage to repulse them, and they bounce, if you will, out of Egypt and into Philistia, the Philistines area, where we have Ascalon and Gath and Ekron, those 5 major cities of the Philistines. The Sea Peoples come in and they conquer them. And they put, if you will, a very strong military force on the northern and eastern border of Egypt. Egypt is in retreat both now militarily and economically. And it seems to be that now is the time that minefield in Timna is abandoned by the Egyptians. The demand for copper is diminished. The flow of tin is disrupted. The economies of the global powers is in disarray. Egypt does not need that copper, and maybe is unable even to defend such a distant outpost for mining. And so now we have the establishment of what will become the Philistines. And we only last year discovered our very first cemetery in coming from the ancient Philistine cities. And what has been discovered based on radiocarbon dating and DNA techniques is that right around 1177 is this influx of Mediterranean Aegean DNA. And So we say, yes, that gives rise to the story of the sea peoples being bounced from Egypt into Philistia. And what we find, based on radiocarbon dating and the DNA analysis, is that within about 4 generations, the sea peoples have intermarried with the Canaanites to the degree that that DNA is now a unique Philistine DNA that is this blend of Aegean and Canaanite DNA. And those are the peoples with whom the Hebrews will contend in the period of the Judges, in the period of David. So that's kind of interesting, isn't it? Well, that brings us to our last slide. What happens in 77 when the Egyptians pull out of the copper field in Timna? Is it abandoned? No, not immediately. It's because the Egyptians actually used Midianites as their metalsmiths. That's true for the copper field at Timna and other copper fields that the Egyptians operated throughout the Negev desert along this Rift Valley, because it is in this Rift Valley that copper is found. So when the Egyptians left, the Midianites didn't find a good reason for leaving. So they stayed there for some number of years, but not long. And it seems like a working date of 1150 for their abandoning Timna makes sense. So they're extracting copper. They hope copper is of value, but there are a lot of difficulties for the Midianites. They aren't as powerful as the Egyptians. They don't have an army to protect a distant outpost from marauders. They don't have the big economy that Egypt has for providing water and food and for providing fuel for smelting. And they don't have a big economy for making sure that they can bring the copper to market. So after about 25, 30 years, that copper mining just ends at Timna. The Midianites are no more operating there. But how do we know the Midianites continued to operate there in the absence of the Egyptians? Well, they repurposed the Temple of Hathor for their own ritual worships methods. They tented the Temple of Hathor. The Egyptians did not tent their temples, but Semites do tent their temples, and the Midianites are Semites, and they tented it. They also stood up standing stones, and that may make you think of the story of Joshua and the conquest when the 12 tribes stood up their stones by the Jordan River as they crossed into the promised land. It's something that Semites do, set up standing stones. But we should understand that their worship at Timna was pagan worship. Midianites were by and large pagans, even though they were a Semitic people. Now, I believe there's evidence that not all Midianites were pagan. I believe that one Midianite priest, at least, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, was a Yahweh worshiper. When I read the accounts in the Exodus, that's what I find. I find that Jethro expected Moses to find Yahweh on Mount Sinai, just as Jethro had found Yahweh years before. And out of the line of Jethro come the Kenites, and it may well be that the Kenites are also Yahweh worshipers. Well, that's our story for today. That is where we're going to leave the Egyptian story of Timna, and we'll pick it up next time, introducing new information about the Jewish or the Hebrew mining in this area, which I hope you'll find very, very interesting. Well, until then, may the Lord bless and keep you well until we meet again. Amen, and have a good day.